When Peary came ashore for their help, a few years earlier, Peary had convinced an Eskimo to show him his people's only source of iron. 3 giant meteorites buried in the ice. Peary then laid claim to the meteorites, even scratching his initials on the surface of one. Kishu and several others labored for 9 days until finally they heaved the 40-ton meteorite on board Peary's ship. The explorer paid them with guns, knives, and biscuits. Then he made a startling proposition.
Lieutenant Peary asked if some of us wouldn't like to go back with him, where there were great buildings and railway trains and lights and many people, and where the sun shone every day in winter, and where people didn't have to wear heavy furs to keep warm. He coaxed my father and the brave man Nuktak, who were the strongest and wisest heads of our tribe, to go with him to America. Our people were afraid to let them go, but Peary promised them that they should have Nuktak and my father back within a year, and that with them would come a great stock of guns and ammunition, and wood and metal and presents for the women and children. So my father believed that for so much good and comfort for his people, they should let him and Nuktak make the trip. Nuktak could not part from Atangana, his wife, and his little girl Aviak, so he took them with him. My mother was dead, and my father would not go without me, so we said a last farewell to home and went on Peary's ship.
And so, 6 Eskimos set off on the long journey to America. Also on board were skeletons Peary had secretly stolen from Eskimo graves. Like the meteorite, he hoped to sell the bones to the Museum of Natural History. On September 30th, 1897, Robert Peary's ship docked at Ordnance Wharf, directly adjacent to the Brooklyn Bridge. Peary had cabled ahead with news of his exotic cargo. Now, a huge crowd eagerly awaited his arrival. 20,000 people visited the ship on the first 2 days to see the giant meteorite and the 6 Eskimos. But no one was more impressed than young Minnick. Never before had he seen so many people. At most, his Inuit community comprised only 234 people, spread over many miles. Now he found himself in the heart of a teeming metropolis.
Oh, I can remember it very well, that day when we first saw the big houses and saw so many people and heard the bells of the cars. It was like a land that we thought must be heaven. When they took us ashore, they brought 5 big barrels. They held the bones of our people who had died. When we asked them why, they told us that they were bringing them here to put in nice boxes where they would be kept safe forever.
Peary had arranged for the meteorite to be taken to the American Museum of Natural History, but no one had made arrangements for the Eskimos.
There was a lapse of 2 years between the time that Boas made his initial request and Peary arrived in Brooklyn. Boas had completely forgotten about that as a possibility, and in fact he was up to his ears in sending out anthropological expeditions on the Jessup expedition to the North Pacific. So he was stunned when he found that Peary had brought Eskimos back to work with anthropological recording here at the museum.
The museum placed the Eskimos under the care of its superintendent, William Wallace. Wallace scrambled to free up space in the basement to accommodate the 4 adults and 2 children. Word soon spread that Eskimos were being kept at the museum and crowds gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the exotic visitors. Many were disappointed to learn that the Inuit were not on display in an exhibit. A New York Times reporter accompanied Minnick on a tour of Central Park. The sight of a bicycle man made him howl with glee, the reporter noted. And he was amazed at the size of the big dogs, as he called the horses he saw in the driveways. The Eskimo men showed an interest in the local women and even made proposals of marriage to a few. But within a few weeks, the Eskimos came down with colds that became progressively worse. Franz Boas was worried. Although I am not formally responsible, the whole thing falls on my shoulders, he confided to a friend. I feel a stone around my heart. Boas contacted Peary.
My dear Lieutenant Peary, we feel very much disturbed regarding the health of the Eskimo family at the museum. And I beg to ask if you will kindly call and give us your advice as to what is best to be done for them. They seem to have severe bronchial trouble, and we fear that it may turn into pneumonia. Sincerely, Franz Boas.
But Robert Peary did not reply. He was en route to Europe for a series of lectures promoting his plans for an expedition to the pole.
I don't think he felt any responsibility for the Eskimos once he dropped them off at the museum. There's no evidence that he visited them, asked them to dinner, talked to them, cared about them. He really gave them so precious little.
Boas attempted to find the Eskimos a way back home.
The closest that Boas could arrange was to get them back to Labrador. But Labrador is a long way from Greenland, and he decided that would be a mistake. So they stayed here, and of course they sickened in the New York environment.
In the hospital, all my father ever did was think about me. He never slept and kept watch over me day and night. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat, and when they brought him something, he demanded that they feed me. And when I seemed to have an appetite, big tears would come to his eyes.
Boas visited Minnick in the hospital and was impressed with his intelligence. The boy had begun to pick up a few English words as soon as he reached this city, Boas noted. After 6 weeks at Bellevue, the Eskimos' health had improved enough for them to return to the museum. This time, they were given a more comfortable space on the 6th floor, where anthropologists were eager to study them.
The essential anthropological problem at the time was to try to account for the history of human cultures. How did all these people get to be the way they are, and how were they related or not related? This was really not known at the time. If you measured their bodies, you could compare the measurements of one group to the measurements of the people on different continents. The visit of Minnick and his family really fits into a much larger story of American anthropology. The overarching worldviews that anthropologists are working with are very racist, built on the notion that the white people are at the top of a ladder, dark-skinned people are at the bottom of the ladder. Boas enters with a very different perspective, and he's really horrified with all this, and he doesn't buy the initial assumptions.
Boas set out to collect data from the Eskimos that would challenge conventional notions of a racial hierarchy among the world's peoples.
His most radical notion is to say that people are not arranged in a hierarchy of more primitive to more advanced and to better and worse, but that all people are essentially the same.
But Boas's studies were cut short in January 1898 when the Eskimos again became sick, forcing them to return to the hospital.
The worst thing for my father was when he got so weak and had to stay in bed and couldn't come over to me. I cried the whole time and couldn't eat anything because I was afraid my father was going to die. He very nearly choked during the night. He was calling out for home, for his family, his friends, and me. I buried my head in my pillow and just cried. When I got to feeling better, they allowed me to go over and lie down next to him. He knew he was going to leave me and was filled with the most awful grief. Your father's spirit will always be with you, Minik, he said in our language. He swallowed heavily, and I knew he was going to die.
On February 17th, 1898, Minik's father died. Initially, there was a disagreement over who owned Kishu's remains. Eventually, an agreement was reached. His internal organs and brain would remain at Bellevue for study, while his skeleton would be sent to the Museum of Natural History to Franz Boas.
The whole experience of Minik and his family, I think, was devastating to Boas. It was a situation that got out of hand. It really, it was nothing that he ever dreamed happening, and nothing he ever wanted to happen. But when things like this happened, you just made the best of it.
Boas had the skeleton cleaned and mounted for the museum's collection. He then made a decision that would come to haunt him. Boas had museum staff stage a funeral of Kishu on the museum grounds for Minik to witness. Boas would later say the ceremony was intended to comfort the young Eskimo.
What Boas said is we wanted to spare Minik the pain of knowing that his father had been rendered into a skeleton and was on the shelves with the rest of the anthropological specimens. Boas took it fairly lightly. He said, well, we were doing it as best for the kid, but, you know, today that looks pretty callous.
It's very unfortunate these people died. He didn't want them to die. He certainly did want them to return to their homeland. But he thought, well, now that they were dead, some good could come of their death, and science could learn from the records of their skeletons.
Boas notified Peary of Kishu's death. From San Francisco, Peary telegraphed a reply. Deeply regret Eskimo's death. Confident everything was done. Entire responsibility, mine. After Kishu's death, William Wallace took Minik and the other Inuit to live with him in the Bronx, but the Eskimos' health continued to decline. Within a few weeks, a Tangana, who had been the first of the Eskimos to sicken, also died. Nuktak prepared a traditional Inuit burial ritual for his wife. According to a detailed account by one of Boas's assistants, Nuktak carried her out of the house into the barn. He then began to talk to the body, speaking fast and in a very low voice, the assistant noted. With one hand, he lifted up the blanket covering her and passed his other over her body from her forehead to her heart. He reproached her for being a shaman and not being able to cure herself, and added, I am sure I shall die myself. Then he took her by the shoulder and shook her hard, telling her to remain where she was. On the 10th day after her death, Nuktak was very anxious to see the grave, and according to Inuit tradition, planned to visit it every 10 days thereafter. By spring, Minik's health had improved, but the others were still gravely ill. Wallace took the ailing Eskimos to upstate New York, where he owned a farm. He hoped the mountain air would improve their health, but their condition only worsened. On May 14th, Nuktak died. 10 days later, his 12-year-old daughter, Aviak, also died. Franz Boas instructed Wallace to send Nuktak and Aviak's bodies back to New York, where the skeletons would be archived alongside Kishu's. After his companion's death, Usakasak refused to return to the house in which Nuktak had died and moved into an old shed near the local church. It is very difficult to keep him there contented, noted Wallace, who managed to convince Peary to take the 23-year-old Eskimo with him to the Arctic that summer. Eight-year-old Minik, however, remained in New York. Wallace and his wife Retta had grown fond of the boy. They took him into their home and set about raising him as one of their own. He became known as Meanie Wallace and took the middle name Peary. It had been a year since Peary brought the 6 polar Eskimos to New York. Now, Minik was the only one left in America. Robert Peary arrived in Greenland in the fall of 1898. He would spend the next 4 years in the Arctic on his most ambitious effort yet to reach the North Pole. If there is no route, he declared, then I shall make one. But almost immediately, Peary encountered a series of setbacks. During the first winter, while pushing north through intense storms and temperatures hovering near -60 degrees, the explorer developed frostbite on his feet, requiring the amputation of 7 toes. Undeterred, he made another push north. Nothing was heard from him for more than a year, and for a while, he was feared lost. On each advance north, Peary relied on the Inuits to drive his sledges. But with each failure to reach the pole, the number of natives willing to accompany him dwindled. In the spring of 1902, despite the promise of rewards, Peary was able to convince just 4 Eskimos to travel northward with him across the frozen sea ice.
They thought these crazy white men were going to get them killed. They were taking them out onto areas of the ice floe and whatnot that no native in his right mind would go out on. Peary would say, we're going there because I want to get there. Until the white men came looking for the pole, the Eskimos didn't really care much about the pole. And why should they? There wasn't any game there. There wasn't any water there. It was a place to go and die. And the natives had always tried to stay away from places where you would go to die. And they thought it was rather curious that these guys like Peary wanted to go to these dangerous places that, frankly, they were afraid of.
On April 21st, 1902, dangerous weather conditions dealt Peary another crushing setback. Stalled by storms and rough ice, and still more than 300 miles from the pole, Peary was forced to turn back.
The Navy put right in his orders that you will get to the pole. We are giving you paid leave to get to the pole and to represent the United States Navy, and nothing short will suffice. Well, he came up short.
As Peary struggled to reach the pole, Minik was settling into life in America with the Wallaces. He divided his time between the family home in New York and their country retreat upstate. He became close friends with the Wallaces' young son, Willie, and attended Mount Hope Public School, where he learned to read and write. Born in a land where life means nothing more than a mere physical existence, a journalist noted, he has been brought by accident into an American home to enjoy all that means. Minnick was enjoying the material comforts of life in America. Then suddenly, Minnick's new life began to unravel. In 1901, after being accused of fraudulent use of museum funds, William Wallace lost his job at the museum. 3 years later, Wallace's wife, Retta, died, and Willie was sent away to live with relatives. Minnick dropped out of school. He and his foster father shared an apartment on 14th Street, while Wallace struggled to make ends meet. Peary was also struggling. When he returned from his failed attempt to reach the North Pole, he was dismayed to learn that public support for his efforts was waning. It took him 3 years to revive public interest in another expedition and to raise funds from wealthy patrons.
Peary was a networker. Whether it was the President of the United States or whether it was any of these industrialist, wealthy men, Peary did have a way of garnering their support and raising money. He was certainly a showman. He could go on tours and circuits and talk about the North Pole and show the Eskimo dogs and tell rather dramatic stories. He did have some charisma, and he could get people to believe in him.
Finally, Peary managed to raise $100,000 to build a new expedition ship, which he named after President Theodore Roosevelt, one of Peary's most prominent supporters. In July 1905, the explorer set off for Greenland, only to return a year later, having failed to reach the pole once again.
Getting to the North Pole meant everything to Robert Peary. He was obsessed and he was determined, and nothing or nobody was going to stop him.
With Roosevelt's support, Peary convinced the Navy to give him another 3 years of paid leave to pursue his Arctic expeditions. In July 1907, he announced what he felt certain would be his last attempt to reach the North Pole. "I believe I shall win this time," he wrote Roosevelt. "I believe this is the work for which God Almighty intended me." That same year, Minnick made a shocking discovery. From newspaper accounts, he finally learned the truth about his father's burial. It had all been a fake. His father's bones were being held at the museum. The 17-year-old Eskimo grew melancholic and restless. "We did our best to cheer him up," Wallace wrote, but it was no use. His heart was broken. He had lost faith in the new people he had come among. Chester Beecroft, a prominent New Yorker, was moved by Minnick's plight and took his case to Washington. Beecroft requested that the government support Minnick and his education. In a letter to President Roosevelt, Beecroft described Minnick as a national guest and a national prisoner, whose condition is becoming a national disgrace. But no one came to Minnick's aid. In June 1908, as he was making final preparations for his expedition north, Robert Peary received a letter from William Wallace.
Dear Lieutenant Peary, Minnick desperately wants to visit his people up north, and I beg you to allow him to accompany you on your journey. Please let me know if you can fulfill this request.
I have received your letter of June 23rd, Peary replied, and while I would like to please Minnie in this matter, I regret that my ship will be too crowded for me to take him this summer. Or, if he is very anxious to get some things from up there, I shall be glad to try to send him back a kayak or a sledge, or whatever he may most desire. More than ever, Peary felt himself in an intense race to reach the North Pole. The previous year, Frederick Cook, a physician and Peary's former colleague, had announced his own plans to reach the pole using a new route. While the Roosevelt still lay docked in New York, Cook was making his way to northern Greenland.
There's no doubt that Peary was getting increasingly desperate. I think he felt that he didn't have much time left, and indeed he didn't. When he left on his last polar expedition, he was 51 years old, 51. I think he thought that it was now or never.
Upon his departure, Peary made a dark promise. This time, I will reach the pole or die. That August, Robert Peary finally set up camp in northern Greenland. The following winter, he set out with 22 Eskimo drivers and 246 dogs, one of the largest polar expedition teams ever assembled. 6 weeks later, while still more than 100 miles from the pole, the size of his crew had dwindled to just 4 Eskimos. Peary would later claim that with this small team, he reached the North Pole on April 9th, 1909. Upon his return to the U.S., Peary's claim was echoed across the country.
Here is the cap and climax, the finish, the closing of the book on 400 years of history. The discovery of the North Pole on the 6th of April, 1909, by the last expedition of the Peary Arctic Club, means that the splendid frozen jewel of the North, for which through centuries men of every nation have struggled and suffered and died, is won at last and is to be worn forever by the stars and stripes.
But almost immediately, doubts surfaced as to whether Peary had actually reached the pole. The same month that Peary supposedly reached the pole, Minnick had decided to leave New York. Increasingly frustrated at the museum's refusal to return his father's bones, he struck out on his own for Greenland, with just $5 in his pocket. Minnick wrote of his decision to Chester Beecroft, who passed his letter along to the press.
When this reaches you, I will be well on my way. You made a brother of me when all the others that were responsible for my being stolen from my own country failed. I don't see any chance in New York, and I don't want to be a burden for you any longer. So I go away. They won't give me my father's body out of the museum, and they never keep their promise. So I'm disgusted and will leave it all if I can. Never mind where I am. I'm just working north. I am homesick and disgusted, and when Commander Peary, who brought me to New York, told me he had no room for me on his ship, I lost hope. This is probably the last letter I will ever write. You see, I worked my way up here, and you can guess how hard it is to beat your way without any money. And many days I have been hungry, and many nights I have cried. Now I am in Canada, and I am sick and weak, and have no more strength to fight off the awful want to die. My poor people don't know that the meteorite that Peary took, it fell from a star. But they know that the hungry must be fed, and cold men must be warmed, and helpless people cared for, and they do it. Wouldn't it be sad if they forgot these and got civilized? I remember one day you told me that the sure way to get revenge is to be unlike the one that hurt you. I'm going to die smiling at Peary and the scientists.
When Minnick's letter was published, his plight created a national furor. 6 weeks after leaving, a bedraggled Minnick returned to the city. The San Francisco Examiner promptly published an article with a banner headline announcing Minnick wanted to shoot Peary. "I would shoot Mr. Peary and the museum director," Minnick reportedly said, "only I want them to see how much more just a savage Eskimo is than their enlightened white selves." Robert Peary's wife, Josephine, was enraged. The Minnick affair, she feared, was becoming a threat to her husband's reputation.
Minnick was giving interviews with newspapers. From Peary's point of view, he didn't like getting bad press. I mean, that was the last thing Peary wanted. He wanted everything to be positive. He wanted, you know, the money flowing in, the support, the accolades, everything. And so Minnick was a problem.
Josephine Peary and a group of Peary's supporters made arrangements for Minnick to join a relief expedition taking supplies to the explorer in Greenland. On July 10th, Minnick, now 18, finally left for his Arctic home. But not before he was forced to sign an agreement stating he would never return to the United States. In August 1909, Minnick looked out on his native land for the first time in 12 years. As his boat sailed into Melville Bay, a thick layer of fog shrouded the water. Then a ship became visible in the distance. On board stood Robert Peary, clad in furskins. He was awaiting passage to New York, where he would make public his claim to have reached the pole first. Before Minnick could leave the ship, Peary forced him to sign a document saying that he had received provisions and supplies from Peary, all that is needed to make him entirely comfortable. When Minnick disembarked, the local Inuits gathered excitedly around him. The ship's crew explained that the young man was the son of the great hunter, Kishu. Minnick was silent. He had forgotten his native language. With gestures, the Eskimos welcomed him back home. Sodak, a powerful shaman, took Minnick under his wing and began to reintroduce him into Inuit life. But after a year, Minnick was still having trouble adapting. He confided his alienation to his old friend, Chester Beecroft.
I don't think both ends in the middle of the earth are worth the price that has been paid to almost find one pole. See all the white bones? Where is my father? Why am I no longer fit to live where I was born? Not fit to live where I was kidnapped. Why am I an experiment there and here, and tormented since the great white pirate interfered with nature and made a failure and left me a helpless orphan, young, abandoned, 10,000 miles from home? I have no friend here or anywhere. I am lonely. Come up here and I will show you how to find the pole. I will make you king. Then, if you want me, I will go back to New York with you. Or stay here. Or go to hell for you, my friend, when there was none.
Minnick also told Beecroft that many Eskimos doubted that Peary had ever reached the pole.
Although Minnick, I don't think, is an objective observer when it comes to Peary. And certainly he did have his issues with Peary, and I think he was embittered. At the same time, I think that Minnick was reporting what he was hearing among Eskimos, and that was, there was doubt that he had made it that far. The rest of the world at that time was gathering around Peary and acknowledging him as the discoverer of the North Pole, and Minnick's going, well, wait a minute, this might not have happened.
As details about Peary's dash to the North Pole emerged, it became apparent that he would have had to travel across the ice at an unprecedented speed to reach the pole when he claimed. Peary continued to press his case. He won the endorsement of the National Geographic Society, and eventually his well-connected supporters convinced Congress to certify that Peary had in fact reached the pole first. While Peary worked to secure his place in history, Minnick continued trying to adapt to life in the Arctic. He relearned his native language and lived with an Eskimo woman for a while, but they quarreled often, and Minnick again struck out on his own. His language skills enabled him to find work as an interpreter on American expeditions in the region, but gradually, he came to long for the life he had known in New York. In the fall of 1916, after 7 years in his homeland, Minnick left the Arctic and returned to America. Confident that the polar controversy still captivated the public, he contacted the press, intending to sell the true story of the discovery of the North Pole. But Americans were preoccupied with the growing war in Europe and no longer interested in who made it to the pole first. As he waited for offers that never came, Minnick worked briefly in a machine shop, visited with old friends, and considered starting a trading business. He talked about returning to Greenland, but never acted on it. Instead, he applied for American citizenship. In the winter of 1917, Minnick headed north to New Hampshire, where there was a demand for lumberjacks. Life in the lumberjack camp was hard and the conditions primitive. The timber was cut in winter, so it could be sent downstream to sawmills in the spring. Minnick was in New Hampshire a year before the flu epidemic that was sweeping the country reached the camps in October 1918. Minnick contracted the disease. 7 days later, on October 29th, Minnick died in the home of a friend.
The story of Minnick is the tragedy where someone, frankly, becomes a stranger in both worlds, all his worlds, his native world, his newfound world. Raised as an Inuit, he comes to New York at an early age and finds himself an orphan. There's so much that he's uncomfortable with, that's difficult for him in New York, but he makes a go of it, like many immigrants. He's trying to learn a new way of life, but it's not fulfilling him, so he tries to go back, which many immigrants do. He goes back and tries to rebuild his traditional life. And then that doesn't work out either because he's a different person. He's not an Inuit. He has different ideas, different perspectives, different ways of looking at the world that he's gotten in New York. He's caught between worlds. He's not fully Inuit. He's not fully American. He's somewhere in between, and those are very sad cases. And I think Minick's life is somewhat of that story.
Within a few decades, the type of research that Franz Boas had conducted on Minick and his family transformed theories of cultural difference, discrediting 19th century concepts of a racial hierarchy. Appointed to the faculty at Columbia University, Boas would come to be regarded as the founder of modern American anthropology. Robert Peary died in 1920 at the age of 63. Nearly 50 years after his death, the National Geographic Society re-examined Peary's records and concluded that most likely Peary had fabricated his claim to have reached the North Pole. The meteorites Peary brought back from Greenland and sold to the Museum of Natural History for $50,000 remain a popular exhibit. In 1993, nearly a century after their deaths, the bones of Kishu, Nuktak, Atangana, and Avayak were taken back to Greenland by a representative from the museum. Minick's body was not among them. He lies buried in a cemetery overlooking a stream in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire.
Stay tuned for scenes from the next American Experience. But first,
the Amazon. Beautiful, dangerous, and in peril.
The native populations are going under. They're really in trouble.
Follow Jean-Michel Cousteau and his team into the heart of the struggle to save this precious region.
This is a global problem. We've all got to get on the same page.
Jean-Michel Cousteau Ocean Adventures. Return to the Amazon, April 2nd at 8/7 Central on most PBS stations.
Darkness. And then, bang, giving birth to an endless expanding existence of time, space, and matter. Now see further than we've ever imagined, beyond the limits of our existence, in a place we call the universe. Chaotic and breathtaking, their beauty forms from the emptiness of space.
Nebulas are everything in the galaxy that stars are not.
Wisps of matter, at times coming together, at others flying apart. Filmy veils, billowing masses, some dark, some glowing in brilliant colors, many taking the shapes of things that are eerily familiar.
It's interesting when people look at nebulas, they sort of start seeing things in it.
Neither stars nor planets, they are the crown jewels of the galaxy. The universe reveals its awesome display of stellar birth, death, and the cycle of creation inside the nebulas. It is one of the most famous space photographs ever taken. As seen by the Hubble Space Telescope, it shows the pillars of creation. Massive columns of dust and gas 7 light years long. As big as they are, the pillars are just a small part of an immense stellar nursery 6,500 light years from Earth, called the Eagle Nebula. Nebulas of all kinds are scattered among the stars everywhere. and are among the most spectacular sights in ours or any galaxy.
Nebulae are beautiful, all of them. They really strike the eye.
From the Greek word for cloud, nebulas are just that. Clouds of interstellar gas and dust, rarely visible to the naked eye. But with telescopes in space and on Earth, their beauty is revealed. Glowing, reflecting, or obscuring the galaxy's light. They are regions where stars are born, where stars die, and where explosions rack the very fabric of space-time.
Nebulas have fantastic shapes, like clouds in the sky on a summer day. They often evoke imagery that hits very close to home. Images of flowers, images of insects, images of people.
It's interesting when people look at nebula, it's like a Rorschach test. They sort of start seeing things in it.
Although nebulas are labeled with numbers from astronomical catalogs, many also have names inspired by their locations or shapes. It's not difficult, for instance, to see why this is called the Butterfly Nebula, or this is known as the Horsehead Nebula. The list goes on.
The Orion Nebula, the Ghost Head Nebula, the Stingray Nebula, the Helix Nebula, the Cat's Eye Nebula, the North American Nebula, the Pelican Nebula.
The astonishing forms nebulas take make them the tourist attractions of the galaxy.
If you've got the family in a flying saucer and you're careening through the Milky Way looking for an interesting rest stop, you're going to go to a nebula.
Like tourist attractions on Earth, faraway nebulas entice us for a closer look.
Man, it's a hike.
One of the prime attractions in the night sky is the Great Orion Nebula. One of the very few nebulas you can see with the naked eye. On a clear night, it appears as a fuzzy star in the Sword of Orion. Probably the most recognizable constellation in the sky.
The Orion Nebula is the most active area of star formation in our galaxy. It lights up the sky like nothing else. So this is a big one. In terms of nebulas, this is the Hollywood sign.
And the reason why travelers want to get close to tourist attractions is the same as why astronomers want a closer look at nebulas. They each want to take photos. After all, tourism, whether earthly or astronomical, is all about the pictures.
Photographs of nebulas occupy a real special niche, a very important niche, I think, because they really do sit at the pinnacle, the confluence of art and science.
Of course, getting good pictures of a nebula isn't just a matter of point and click. In the mountains north of San Diego, a group of amateur stargazers have an especially tough road to follow in seeking out nebulas and taking great pictures.
It is always worth the long drive to come out here. Night under the stars, even if I don't do any imaging, is worth it, just to see what I can't see from home.
When the equipment is this complex, these enthusiasts aren't just taking pictures. Here, the word is imaging. And their favorite targets are the nebulas.
Just being able to look at them and imagine what's going on out there in that gas cloud, and being able to see a sense of where stars are forming, it's just a great kind of a sensory experience to have.
In addition to their portable telescopes, the group has also built a complex of permanent observatories. Inside the enclosure housing their big 20-inch telescope, accomplished astrophotographer Alan Smallbone attaches a special astro camera to the eyepiece. He's preparing to image the Orion Nebula.
It's a very challenging object to me because it has very light areas, it has very bright areas, it has very dark areas, and it's a very difficult item to photograph accurately.
The digital cameras used by today's astrophotographers emulate color vision in the human eye itself. There are 3 kinds of cone cells on the retina, each sensitive to either blue, green, or red light. That's why those colors are considered the primary colors of light. But the retina of an astro camera is a computer.